Michael Reynolds locked the heavy glass cabinet and set the inventory list on the counter. The pharmacy smelled of sterile dust and synthetic compounds, a scent that had marked every morning for 12 years. He verified the prescription, counted the pills with rhythmic precision, and checked the wall clock. It was 8:15. His life moved with the reliability of a metronome. Every patient received the same nod, the same polite instruction, and the same measured tone. But as he turned toward the break room, the television mounted in the corner flickered to life. The local news anchor's voice cut through the quiet, announcing that the stock market had hit record highs again. The numbers flashed in bright red across the screen. Michael stopped. He watched the graph climb in a jagged, aggressive line. His colleagues in the front area were already murmuring, their eyes fixed on the screen with a hunger he found difficult to process. He took a breath, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin, too recycled. He looked at the rows of identical medicine bottles and then back at the shifting digital charts. The routine that had felt like safety for a decade now felt like a cage. He reached for his ledger, but his hand hovered over the paper, hesitant. Something about the certainty of the crowd outside made him feel entirely alone. Michael pushed open the break room door. The air was thick with the scent of reheated coffee and an unnatural, buzzing energy. 3 of his coworkers were huddled around a small table, their phones held high like talismans. One pharmacist tapped his screen with frantic, repetitive motions, his face flushed and his eyes wide. "Look at the gains," he shouted, shoving the device toward the others. "It is impossible to lose right now," they cheered. A sharp, jagged sound that bounced off the linoleum walls. Michael stood in the doorway, his lunchbox gripped in his hand. He watched them lean in, their bodies angled toward the light of the screens. They were not discussing fundamentals. They were not talking about earnings or long-term growth. They were simply vibrating with the thrill of the climb. One coworker caught Michael's eye and beckoned him over, waving a hand dismissively at the reports on the table. "Stop worrying about the inventory. Michael, put your money in this now, or you will regret it for the rest of your life." Michael shook his head, offering a tight, thin smile, and retreated to the furthest corner of the room. He sat down, the distance between his stool and their table feeling like a vast, uncrossable chasm. He looked at their animated faces and realized they were not looking at data. They were looking at a dream, and they were blind to the reality of the floor beneath their feet. Michael slipped into the cramped back office and pulled the door shut, locking out the high-pitched chatter of the break room. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the steady, mechanical hum of the refrigeration units. He moved to his small desk, cleared a space among the stacks of insurance claims, and pulled a worn, leather-bound volume from his bag. The cover was scuffed, the edges soft from years of use. He leaned back, letting the dim light of the overhead lamp fall across the pages. He turned to a marked section, his thumb tracing the worn paper. There, in bold, stark ink, were the words, "Independent thinking is essential." He read them once, then twice, the weight of the statement anchoring his scattered thoughts. Outside, he could hear the muffled sound of a television news broadcast, the anchor's voice booming with excitement about the latest market surge. Michael did not look up. He stared at the sentence until the words felt like his own. The headlines promised fortune, but they offered no substance. He set the book down, closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and felt the familiar, frantic rhythm of the crowd outside lose its grip on him. He reached for a blank notepad, pushed the noisy world aside, and began to work in the quiet space he had claimed for himself. Michael spread 3 years of quarterly reports across his desk. They were thick, bound in gray paper, and smelled of long-term neglect. While the break room crowd chased the flashing lights of new tech, Michael focused on the unglamorous. He traced rows of balance sheets with the tip of his pen, ignoring the booming market indexes on the office monitor. He looked for the companies that everyone had forgotten, the ones that provided basic, essential infrastructure. He found a sector that had seen no growth in years, ignored by the media and abandoned by the speculators. To his peers, these businesses were dead weight. To Michael, they were anchored in reality. He calculated the debt-to-equity ratios, cross-referencing them against current inflation trends. The math was dry, predictable, and remarkably steady. He ignored the ticking clock and the afternoon rush of customers. his focus narrowing to the numbers on the page. By the time he finished, he had mapped out a portfolio that contained none of the popular stocks currently surging in value. He drew a final, heavy line across his notepad, marking his departure from the herd. He was no longer reacting to the noise. He was operating on his own terms, built on the slow, deliberate work of reading what others refused to see. Outside the back office, the pharmacy break room had become a pressure cooker. The television played on a loop, showing ticker tapes climbing into record territory, and every coworker was glued to the screen. Michael stepped out to grab a coffee, and the air hit him instantly thick with the heat of frantic excitement. A colleague lunged forward, waving a smartphone screen in Michael's face. "You are missing it, Michael. Every second you wait, you are losing a fortune." They were loud, their movements jerky and impatient. They crowded around the small table, sharing tips like secrets that were about to expire. When Michael shook his head and declined to buy into the latest hype tech stock, the mood shifted. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, sharp and dismissive. One coworker stepped into his path, blocking the exit. "Still playing it safe with those boring, stagnant companies? You are leaving money on the table, man. It is a guaranteed win." They leaned in, eyes wide and desperate for validation. Michael stood his ground, his grip tight on his mug. Their voices rose, mocking his caution as cowardice. They were convinced the ascent would never end, and they treated his skepticism as a personal insult to their own brilliant prospects. The shift did not happen with a bang, but with a thin, electronic chime from the television. The ticker tape, once a steady climb of green, turned to a jagged red cliff. The break room fell silent. The coworker who had been blocking the door dropped his hand, his eyes fixed on the screen as the numbers plummeted. It was a rapid, violent descent. The frantic energy that had filled the room only an hour ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. Michael stood in the corner, his coffee forgotten on the counter. The only sound was the drone of the news anchor, whose voice had dropped to a monotone report of total market evaporation. One by one, the others sank into their chairs, their faces drained of color. The smartphones that had been waved in Michael's face were now lifeless in their palms. No one spoke, no one moved. The bravado had vanished, leaving only the weight of the silence. They stared at the monitor, watching their supposed fortunes dissolve into nothingness. The air in the room felt thin, heavy with the realization that the frenzy was over, and the cost was everything they had chased. Michael sat at his desk, the quiet hum of his computer the only sound in the room. He logged into his brokerage portal. The interface displayed a series of steady, modest figures, reflecting the performance of the undervalued assets he had researched months ago. His losses were negligible, a minor dip in a long-term strategy. He leaned back, his chair creaking against the floor. Across the room, his coworkers remained frozen. One man was staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, repeatedly refreshing a page that showed nothing but red. Another was slumped over the break room table, his head resting on his folded arms, shoulders rising and falling in slow, ragged breaths. Michael stood up, walked to the sink, and rinsed his mug. The water made a sharp, clattering sound against the ceramic. Nobody looked up. The irony was absolute. The laughter that had filled this space weeks ago was replaced by the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing. He watched them for a moment, seeing the realization settle into their posture. They were trapped by the very market moves they had once bragged about. Michael turned his back on the group and returned to his work, his focus undisturbed by the quiet collapse behind him. Years drifted by, and the cycle began to repeat. The morning news flashed warnings of a fresh, violent market contraction. Fear acted like a physical weight in the pharmacy. The staff moved with frantic, jerky motions. They were hitting the sell buttons on their devices, faces tight, eyes darting to the scrolling red numbers on every screen. The panic was infectious. It bled into the hallway, the break room, and the stock room. Michael kept his focus on his terminal. He ignored the clamor of voices shouting about impending total collapse. He opened his portfolio, bypassed the panicked noise, and pulled up the performance data for 3 solid, long-standing companies. Their values had plummeted, dragged down by the broad, irrational sell-off. The market was dumping quality for cash. Michael did not hesitate. He moved his cursor, clicked the buy order, and confirmed the transaction. Then he did it again and again. His fingers moved with precise, rhythmic intent. He watched the shares transfer into his account at prices that had not been seen in a decade. Around him, the room was a blur of frantic exits and desperate calls. Michael sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the data, systematically gathering the assets that everyone else was throwing away in their terror. The younger pharmacist stood by the edge of Michael's desk, his eyes fixed on the green, ascending lines of the monitor. He looked at the screen, then at Michael, then back to the screen again. The silence between them was stark compared to the frantic noise of the preceding weeks. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, tight pitch. "How do you know you are right when everyone else is wrong?" he asked. He watched Michael's hands as they moved across the keyboard, steady and slow. Michael stopped. He set his pen down on the blotter with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo in the small space. He turned his chair to face the man. He did not smile, nor did he look away. "I do not assume I am right," Michael said. "I simply do my own thinking. The decision is mine." He picked up the pen again and returned his gaze to the data. The young man stood motionless for a beat, processing the weight of the statement, before turning away to return to his own station. Michael continued his work, his focus unbroken, his movements unchanged by the question, as if the answer had been settled long before the words were ever spoken. The final day arrived with the same sterile scent of medicine that had greeted him decades before. Michael signed the last of the inventory logs, capped his pen, and stood up. His workspace was empty. The computer terminal screen went dark. He walked to the front of the pharmacy, past the rows of shelves and the counters where he had spent his life observing the patterns of others. He stepped out through the glass doors for the last time. The street outside was crowded, people moving in a chaotic, hurried rush toward the subway station. Michael adjusted his stride, moving against the flow of the panicked commuters. He reached into his pocket and felt the weight of his keys. Behind him, the pharmacy door latched shut. He had built his fortune not through luck, but through the refusal to follow the tide. He had kept his own counsel while others traded their security for the comfort of the crowd. He stood on the sidewalk, watched the sea of people move past him, and took a deep breath of the morning air. He was done. He had navigated the noise, ignored the mania, and emerged with his own reality intact. Michael turned the corner and walked away, his pace steady, his path entirely his own.